imagine an opportunity to come together with the foremost thinkers of our time and explore different possibilities for peace. Euphrates Summit, Our World Beyond 9/11.
Our first speaker is Tom Quiggin, and he is the senior researcher at the Canadian Centre of Intelligence and Security Studies at Carleton University. A court-qualified expert, qualified expert on terrorism and a veteran of 20 years in the intelligence community, he is also the author of a recent book on national security intelligence requirements. He spent 15 years in military service, with time deployed in Bosnia and Croatia in 1994, among other foreign assignments. His expertise on security, intelligence, and terrorism have assisted the UK, Germany, the Netherlands, the US, Singapore, and Canada. And today we welcome him to our terror hotspot here in Elsa, Illinois. So please help me welcome Tom Quiggin.
Good morning, and thank you very much for having me here, and thank you very much for Principia hosting this. I was fortunate this morning that I got up at 5:30 to be able to go running around this rather beautiful campus. Where I live in Ottawa right now is in the center of downtown, surrounded by concrete and buildings, which is convenient but not necessarily pleasant or conducive to peaceful thoughts. But certainly here at Principia, it's an opportunity to sort of enjoy and expand a bit more, and it's an excellent place to think about these kinds of problems. So Janessa asked me to come down and talk a bit about terrorism, a rather difficult subject to address in 15 minutes due to its complexity and long history. But certainly to say that terrorism, in fact, has been around for more than 3,000 years. Suicide terrorism is nothing new. It's been around for 2,500 years or more. And you may recall a fellow in the Bible named Samson pulled the temple down one day. If you go back and read the background into that, that was political violence in order to cause a political change. And interestingly enough, about 3,000 people died in that incident, which is curious if you think about 9/11. Anyway, what are we talking about terrorism? Everybody uses the word terrorism, but very few people stop to think what it actually means. Terrorism, it's the use of violence, to be sure, or it's the threat of the use of violence. It's aimed at a particular part of the population, usually a civilian population, and it has political aims. So tyranny isn't necessarily terrorism. Muammar Gaddafi was a nasty man, he was a tyrant, etc., but wasn't necessarily a terrorist. So terrorism does have a very specific sort of set of values, a very specific case about it. But it's the act of generating fear through the use of violence in order to get political aims, in order to get things changed. Here's a statement I make quite regularly, and people generally speaking don't like it, but in fact it's accurate. All terrorism is political. A little difficult sometimes with Al-Qaeda out there running around. People go, oh, it's about religion, it's about religious values, it's about religious fundamentalism. And the answer is, no, it's not. It's about politics. All terrorist groups, no matter where they're from, whether it's the FLQ that came out of Canada in the 1970s, whether it was Timothy McVeigh in Oklahoma, the Irish Republican Army, the Basque Separatists, the Red Army, Baader-Meinhof Gang, Al-Qaeda, the list goes on and on. The aim that they have are political. They are attempting to make political change. That's the point of what they're doing. Some of the window dressing may be religious. The justifications may be religious or ethnic or linguistic or historical. But every terrorist group is out trying to make a political change. Even when you read Al-Qaeda's various documents and communiques, they always start out with religious window dressing in the name of Allah, the merciful, the compassionate. And then it goes into a diatribe about some former important religious figure from the past. But when it moves into the actual demands, then you realize what they're demanding is political change. It's not a theological argument between Christianity and Judaism and Islam. It's very much a political argument. Here's another thought that's interesting. Terrorism is the weapon of the weak. Weak people use terrorism, not strong people. If a terrorist group had a practical ideology that people liked, if they had a mass following, if they had organization skills and money and that sort of thing, they'd become a political party. That's what they'd be. The way terrorism frequently ends in a lot of countries is when the terrorist group grows up and becomes a political party, if they are in fact strong enough to get there. Most terrorist groups don't do that. They fail because they are weak and because they have no popular following. When you are being attacked by a terrorist, one of the things you should focus on in your mind is saying, this is the act of someone who is angry but weak. Now, one of the interesting things about terrorism is the use of weapons. So if you ask people, what is the weapon that terrorists use, you'll get bombs is typically the answer. Recently, airplanes, not a bad weapon. Guns, of course, anthrax on occasion, whatever. But ultimately, if you're a terrorist group and you're weak and you're trying to impact political change somewhere, the only actual weapon you have is the ability to instill fear in others. That is the actual weapon of terrorism. Bombs and guns and stuff are what we see on TV, and that creates the noise, that creates the impact. But the actual weapon itself is fear. If you are weak and you want to attack a strong opponent, you can't do it militarily, you can't do it through the political system, you can't buy them off because you don't have the money. So what you can do, though, is you can instill fear in them, and if you can instill that fear, then you can force them to change. Unfortunately, right now, we live in an age of fear, where everything's about fear. The food you eat is going to kill you, the environment's going to kill you, your political system is going broke, your country's going to be ruined. There's this constant message of fear all the time. If you're a terrorist, that's a great thing, because that serves your cause. But if you choose to reject fear and to reject error, then terrorism, in fact, loses its strength and, by definition, goes away. Another interesting thought is terrorism occurs. It happens. We can't deny that. Terrorist attacks have been occurring for 3,000 years. They're occurring now, and I suspect 200 or 300 years from now, there will still be terrorism. The question is, how do you respond to it? And an interesting sort of thought about an event such as 9/11 is 9/11, the event itself, did not shape the future of America, its responses, or the future of the rest of the world and how it responded. The event itself does not shape the future. What shapes the future is how you respond to it and what decisions you make immediately thereafter. That's a bit of I Ching philosophy for you, actually. That's a very old thought from our Chinese friends. But nonetheless, it remains valid today. It's not the event that shapes your life, it's how you react to it. If you choose to react intelligently, if you choose to react with knowledge, then you can defeat terrorism, or at least subdue it, or make it irrelevant. If you react poorly through fear, and if you try to apply power to that situation, then quite often you just wind up making it worse rather than better. So how you choose to react is critical, and knowledge, it's the knowledge that's the absolute key thing. Another interesting thing, and this feeds into the knowledge bit, and we'll see where this is going in a while, is a lot of people tend to say that terrorists are crazy, that they're fanatics, that they're drug addicts, they're alcoholics, mommy beat them up when they were 4 years old, their daddy abandoned the family and they've got issues. And you'll hear a whole bunch of psychological bafflegap about why terrorists are terrorists. Here's the simple fact. The claim of mental disease or defect amongst terrorists is lower than the population as a whole. The incidence of alcoholism and drug use amongst terrorists is lower than the populations from which they are drawn. Mom and dad are still married. They went to school. Typically they have technical educations. Typically they come from the middle class. Typically they are not fanatics. Typically they come from, in the case of terrorism that has a religious aura about it, such as Al-Qaeda, typically they come from low-practicing families or from non-practicing families. So when people say, oh, you know, they're all crazed up on fundamentalism and stuff like that, the reality is they use that rhetoric after they join the terrorist group, after they commit an act of terrorism, but the backgrounds from which they're drawn tend to be quite stable. So if there's something that is terrifying about terrorism, it is the fact that terrorists tend to be educated, rational, goal-seeking, thoughtful, politically informed people. They are not crazy, stupid, fanatics, alcoholics, or drug addicts. And that's actually a little bit scary. And that feeds back into the question of knowledge in the sense that we really have to know what's going on and really have to understand it in order to deal with it. Here might be the biggest single problem. Dr. Zogby referred to this. It's the issue of information knowledge and how most of it's taken out of context. All knowledge is contextual. If you do not understand who made a statement, when they made the statement, why they made the statement, and what was going on around them at the time when they make the statement, you really don't understand much of what's going on. So, let me just put that there and put that thought to you. All knowledge is contextual. You have to understand what's going on. So let me give you a sort of example about contextual knowledge. I work with a woman in Ottawa. She's a colleague of mine. She's probably more intelligent than I am. She's a better critical thinker than I am. And most importantly, she can integrate knowledge across boundaries better than I can. So she has been an extraordinary help to me over the years in doing a number of different projects. And when I need my work criticized by somebody who can do it critically but nicely, without making me feel like too bad, she's the one I go to. So she's having like a really important birthday coming up, and I thought, well, I should do something nice for her. So she's not really a girlfriend, so that kind of cancels out the whole perfume, jewelry, clothes kind of thing. She's a bit of a techno geek, but she's already got an iPad, an iPod, and a dual-core processor or something, rather computer that I don't understand. So the technology gifts were kind of out. So I looked at her lifestyle, I looked at the way she lives, and said, well, what would be appropriate? So I've driven with her in a car a few times, and I thought, you know what would be really good for her, given her background in life, would be driving lessons. Seriously. Okay. A number of people expressed the same sort of point of view did, that saying, well, that's not very nice. The word misogynist actually came up in there once. And another friend of mine said, well, that's a rather complicated way of committing suicide, isn't it? Wouldn't it be easier just to shoot yourself than to get a woman driving lessons? So I thought, well, no, I know this person, I know what her life entails and whatever, and I thought this would be truly a good thing to do. So I looked at issues like high-speed braking, how do you correct a corner, how do you correct a car coming out of a corner at drift, how do you attack the apex of a corner and stuff like that, and decided that no, this is probably the right thing to do, notwithstanding the humor and sometimes less than humorous statements I'm getting back. So our driving lesson's a gift for a woman from a man. And the answer is very much, it turned out yes. I do believe that in fact it's a good idea. That's her in the car there. For those of you that keep track of these things, that's a Formula F2000 Ford. And yes, it is what it looks like. Those are the cars at the track. And I don't know, judge the smile for yourself. Now, when I first said I was going to get a woman driving lessons, there was a whole lot of really nervous humor and laughter. And a few people looked at me with that sort of like, what's wrong with that guy? What was different when I put up the picture here was the context of it. When I say driving lessons, you're thinking about like a little four-door car somewhere with Bill's Driving School written on the road, and you're thinking what a horrible man he really is. But when you change the context and put it into something like this, it gives it a whole new feeling. So let me talk a bit about some of the knowledge that's getting passed around right now in the terrorism discourse. One of the things we hear quite frequently is, you know, Tom, Muslims say it's okay to kill infidels, and they call us infidels, so they like killing infidels. And you go, oh boy, here we go. It's a context issue, folks. Also, if anybody happens to read the Bible at all and check into it, you'll find that Jesus says something to the effect of, those people who would not have me reign over them, bring them in front of me and I will slay them. That's in Luke, by the way. So again, when you listen to that, there are a number of people saying, Jesus says it's all right to kill non-believers, and Muslims say it's all right to kill non-believers. It's a question of context in both times. As much as the driving sort of scenario changes the context, whether it's Bill's Driving School or a Ford Formula 2000, this changes its context as well. The Muslims do in fact say it's okay to kill infidels, but there's a context to it. The first thing is you have to live in a Muslim majority nation. Then you have to be invaded from the outside and have your country taken over by infidels in a battle. Then you have to negotiate with them, explain to them, try and understand why they're there, and try to agree to go away. And then finally, if all of that fails, then it's okay to kill them. In other words, if you look at the context of what's in the Quran and how it addresses these issues, it's essentially the rules of war. And if you read the United Nations Charter, or if you read NATO's Charter, and if you look at the issues of self-defense as expressed in the NATO Charter and the UN Charter, it's exactly the same stuff that's in the Quran. There's nothing new. The thing with Luke and Jesus, it's actually the voice of Jesus speaking, but it's a parable. He's using somebody else's voice at the time. And the parable in no way justifies the killing of non-believers, but yet people take that out of context and use it. So anytime you hear people being critical or talking about terrorism or talking about the various ideologies that are being passed around, be critical and try and find out what is the context. Who said it? When did they say it? Why did they say it? And what issues were they trying to address at the time? If you do not have that, then you are in serious trouble and you will get stuff wrong continuously. Dr. Zogby's points that we operate in ignorance most of the time, it's very much a matter of context. Let me also just quickly mention causality. Here it is 10 years since 9/11. Who amongst you could stand up in a minute or less and explain why those folks attacked on 9/11? What were they trying to do? What were they trying to accomplish? Have you heard any real intelligent debates in public about why those guys did that? And by, well, they hate us because they hate our values, I don't mean that. And, well, they're all crazy, you know. Well, we've already established they're not crazy. So why did they do that? In the American context, in the Canadian context, and in a large part of the European context, we lack causality. We will not understand, we don't try to understand why these folks do things. So, to go back to my earlier point where I say these folks are rational, they're goal-seeking, they're thoughtful, they're educated, they're very political in the way they think about things. The question is, why did they do that? Interestingly enough, in public discourse in America right now, you're not actually allowed to even ask that question. As soon as you start to ask it, you find yourself in a lot of trouble. It's an interesting sort of point. One sort of very last quick thing before I move on and turn the floor over to Richard. What motivates these folks? Why do folks become terrorists anyway? We've already sort of established that they're rational, they're educated, they're thoughtful. They do tend to have strong political views of the world. And in their mind, in their perception, in their reality, they are the victims of oppression. That oppression may be real, or it may be simply a perception in their minds that they're the victims of oppression, but nonetheless, it's very much in their minds that they are on the receiving end of the oppression. They tend to come from the educated classes and the wealthy class, so they see themselves acting out not necessarily in behalf of themselves, but on the behalf of their poor countrymen or their poor group or whatever it is they're a part of. They tend to have a very strong view of justice, a very strong sense of social justice. Now, when you say, well, how can you kill someone in the name of social justice? Well, then obviously the arguments fall apart, but nonetheless, there they are. So if you go back and look at what motivates terrorists, most of the time, it is a sense of oppression. It is a sense of a lack of social justice and the sense of having a lack of voice. Put those things together and put someone in a very weak position where they don't have money, they don't have influence, they don't have power, and they can't speak to a larger audience. Then you get someone who gets very frustrated very quickly and will very rapidly turn to violence. So anytime you see a social movement growing, listen to its voice, like Dr. Zogby said, try and understand what that voice is saying, and then communicate with those people. If you do that, then you'll find that that drift towards terrorism tends to stop. If, on the other hand, you isolate them and cut them away, that drift towards terrorism will continue. Anyway, I will leave it there, and I will turn the floor over to Richard, who's going to talk about, I think, a little more sort of pragmatic sort of issues. So thank you very much.